Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to Knowledge Unbound. My name is Brian Dewsbury, and I am your host of a podcast called Knowledge Unbound. Knowledge Unbound is brought to you by the Rios Institute for Racially Just, Inclusive, Open STEM Education. We are generously funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. My producer, Mr. Segev Amasai, computer engineering major, class of 2025. Segev, what's up?
How's it going, Brian?
How's it going? Brian? I feel like if you were using your DJ name, and my audience, my producer is also a DJ. He goes by DTX. If you're using your DJ voice...
Brian, I am DTX.
Oh, okay. All right. My apologies. But if you were in DDX mode, you would have been a lot more decisive in your response.
Well, that is very true.
Okay. Hey, welcome, Segev. Segev is our wonderful producer for all of these episodes. This is a series that we will be in conversation, in community really, with people who just think provocatively, think beautifully, think progressively about what education and science education can be. I am honored to welcome so many diverse and inspirational guests to the studio. We'll be recording most of our episodes from the Science Education and Society program at Florida International University. And we will just ask people their story. Part of it is their personal journey, part of it is their projects, but all of which we can learn from in ways that are unique, that are nuanced, to make education just a much more beautiful thing. Today, it is my great pleasure to start this series off with just a good friend of mine and somebody I know who's thought deeply and provocatively about what science education can be. She is the director of the Rios Institute, that is from which this podcast is coming. Dr. Carrie Diaz-Eaton is also an associate professor of computer science and math at Bates College in Maine. And we just had a wonderful time because, her and I have gone back and forth on the vision for this podcast and what opportunity we have to bring this conversation to the national audience. And I think it's fitting to begin this 10 episode series with a conversation with her, because I think her journey and her thinking on not just this podcast, but these whole issues around science education is really important. So I really hope you enjoyed. So, Carrie, you've always been an interesting collaborator to me because, I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of people on social justice related things in STEM education. And I guess I don't want to kind of take up too much airtime here, but I feel like you get that so much of this is nuanced, it's hard to explain, and for this to work, right? For the social justice outcomes we're looking for in STEM education, we have to be willing to sort of be brave and bring up things and go into spaces that, quite frankly, historically has been frowned upon for the kind of profession we have. And I guess in that, I see a tension between your activist self and your, I actually don't even know how you identify professionally now in terms of math education, computer science education.
All of the identities.
We're doing that? All right, cool. Your tension between your activist self and the confluence of disciplines that you represent. Start wherever you want with that. But that's sort of my question.
Which question do I go for first? Let me start with that tension, because sometimes I've talked to folks or recounted how there were times where being in STEM meant I should erase the activist self. Mm-hmm. So I know we've talked about this before. The activism that I've been involved with was something you're involved with just by being, right? Mm-hmm. And for me, I saw it when my Spanish-speaking church in Providence that my dad went to was involved with helping new immigrants come to the area and all of the issues they were dealing with. And my dad was like, I'm here for you because people were here for me when I came to the U.S. But I never connected those to my STEM identity. They were very separate from me. And even though I maintained activism even through high school, through college, etc. But when I was in graduate school, it was made clear I had to choose who I was going to be portrayed as, and it should be STEM and not to activism.
Well, let me ask you this real quick without derailing you too much, but did something happen that forced that choice? Or did somebody kind of look at you and see this set of things you're doing and say, yo, you need to kind of get over here?
Yeah, so I think there was a particular moment where I was having someone review my CV for me. And this was a CV that I was using to apply for a scholarship.
Okay.
And I was a maybe first-year grad student. And I had applied for the scholarship when I first started, but I didn't get it. So I went, I was getting a little more coaching this time. So when she was reviewing, and best intentions, of course, right? This is how it always happens. When she was reviewing it, she saw, oh, you'd been involved in a gay-straight alliance. Maybe we should take that off your CV. Right? And so I think that's like the best moment I can tell where I'm I'm supposed to be separate about this. Like, right? Like, it's literally not supposed to be on my CV. There's always been moments of discordance where I think, like, I put some activist energy into, say, changing the climate for teaching in my department or things like that. So I didn't stop. I just changed what kind of activism I was involved. Even though that was heretical for our one department, at least it wasn't putting something about queerness on my CV, right? And so, especially in the South, right? And so I feel like a lot of my journey over the last decade has like been reintegrating what were already parts of me.
So is that reintegration, is the success of that reintegration now a function of where you are professionally, and that you're tenured, and that is there's cachet to your name, I don't want to make it about that, right? But the reality is some of that integration is riskier at different points. And I just don't know how much that factored into the intensity of the reintegration process, if I could call it that.
I think there were two things going on simultaneously. So where I was prior was a non-tenure institution. So I didn't have tenure. But I was getting some national appreciation, should you say. I guess this is one way of putting it. I was getting noticed.
I'd like to thank the Academy.
I felt more confident in if my current place doesn't like what I'm doing, I can move and that's okay. Yeah. So it's not quite the same as the security of getting tenure. It's more like a different kind of job security that comes from self-confidence. Yeah. I don't know how to describe that in any other way.
No, I think it makes sense, and I feel like I also heard something else in your comment about bringing activist energy to, say, teaching climate in your department, and I think about Malcolm X's much used but often misquoted quote, "By any means necessary," and maybe an interrogation of that, saying, well, you have to sort of figure out which means are necessary, right? So it doesn't mean that it's just any means, right? The necessary part is the qualifier for what the means are and where it goes. And it sounded like, okay, do you pick up the battle to fight for everything goes on your CV versus right now, this is where the fires need to be put out or addressed? Is that kind of navigation an essential part of your activism? Like kind of figuring out where needs your strengths, where is most politically salient at the time, when to give trouble, when to give good trouble. Like I know it's your name, right? Like how it is. I'm asking this question on behalf of people who are hearing you and want to make these decisions, right? But maybe need a little bit of a playbook.
Well, I'm going to take a play from your book, which is knowing yourself, doing that like reflection on yourself. The other thing I will say is I'm a boundary spanner because I've been involved in multiple worlds, because, I have a white mother and a Hispanic father, because, I identify as queer, but I'm I'm in a heterosexual marriage with kids, right? And, this kind of boundary spanning, it has kind of meant that, like, I could camouflage, but also, like, if I felt like I needed to. But I think that sort of, there was some self-consciousness around whether I was dark enough to be like an advocate for the Latino, community, or because my Spanish wasn't good enough, or I had this privilege of a heterosexual marriage, so could I really like claim being queer, right? Like, so I think there's that actually happened. That happened at like a later point, which was I think when I was teaching at Unity, my very first job, one of the really interesting things that happened was being at a predominantly white institution where I was for many years the only faculty of color. I was the touchstone for the students of color, for the Latino students. And I was involved in as a club advisor for American Sign Language Club and a few other kinds of, I guess you could say, diversity initiatives. All of a sudden, it didn't matter that I was, in whatever marriage or had whatever level of melatonin. It mattered that I was making connections with students and that we were making a difference in each other's lives.
Right.
And then hearing that come back to me, keeping in touch with those students over the years and like having them say, it was so important for you to be there. And then that boosted my confidence that I gave myself permission to do the work. And then around the same time, for me, the critical event was the Trump election. And the intensity of hatred against immigrants going on there. And then as soon as the election happened, Maine is under ICE jurisdiction in its entirety because of its border with the ocean as well as Canada. And seeing ICE vehicles drive down my road the very first day that Trump was officially in office. And I started getting much more vocal at that point in my own institution about how a lot of the folks who were graduating in environmental law enforcement were border control and getting hired there because there aren't enough, wildlife jobs in northern Maine to employ all the students. So there's where the money was, right? And how it was our ethical obligation to start thinking about these things. And I don't know, I just found that confluence of internal building and external happening. I was in the right place to start being more vocal.
Man, a lot to unpack there. Because, well, no, in a good way, right? Because I think maybe to push back a little bit on my own playbook question, or the use of the word playbook in that context. What seemed to matter more was you were in a mental space where you looked around you and you saw that what the moment needed was more than just being an educator. Right? Or let me put it a different way. Let me put it a different way. More than just teaching content. Right? You were looking at an election, you're looking at the sentiment and the climate of your community, of your state, and thinking like it's not good enough just to teach people to differentiate equations, right? Like and that is not a playbook thing. That's like a mindset. Right. And I'm wondering if you could sort of unpack that a little bit.
So how did I come to that mindset? I think there are two things. I think one is a number of student interactions over the years, where they've, maybe also reflecting on my own, like what really made a difference in me choosing my career path. And yes, it was my relationships with certain individuals that, just kept encouraging me. But I think it was more amplified when I went to a liberal arts college because at that predominantly undergraduate institution, the small liberal arts college, they really emphasized the relationship with students.
Right.
And I do admit that it was, for someone especially out of mathematics, we're very sort of more individual. We're all about like the pristine content, It was
the purity of the discipline.
Yeah, and I had always been at a huge, flagship universities. So I didn't have that experience exactly.
Right.
So I had to figure out what that meant. I think that was something I have gotten much better at over the years as a teacher. I look back at how I initially started. And I really do think that being at that small liberal arts college was something
Yeah.
that really changed my mindset about what's the role of the relationship with the student.
Hey, it reminds me a little bit sometimes when I hear these conversations happen in mixed audiences, and by mixed I mean K-12 and higher ed. And I do see sometimes a collective eye roll from the K-12 people because they're like,
I know.
well,
they had that figured out for years.
You don't do really, like, well, how do you do your job then, right? Like, and it's just amazing in higher ed. We talk about this and like, oh my goodness, wow, relationships is a thing. You could, and I get it. I get how the system is set up. That makes it, hard for people to see that and how we train, but just as a point of humor. Like,
yes,
it's kind
no,
of funny to see.
And even when we have these like pedagogy courses that are part of GTA training programs or certificate teaching programs in college teaching, usually we focus on content pedagogy or something like that. We're not focusing on the importance of relationship making, or we're reading like literature on education and stereotype threat, but we're not talking about relationships. That's not part of the typical sort of one semester college pedagogy course either.
Right.
I think we still have a lot to integrate on that conversation that K-12 already knows on. And somehow, I don't know, we think at 18 your brain switches and you don't need relationships anymore.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I look back and think it's hilarious, but the prior version of me thought it was completely logical.
It's like, I'm good. I just want content now. I had 18 years of that. Enough.
I'm sure that's exactly what I thought when I was 18.
So let's pivot just a little bit to RIOS, Racially Just Inclusive Open Science Institute, generously funded by the Hewlett Foundation, which you have the privilege of being a PI. Thanks for the great work you do on that front. Where do you see RIOS playing a role in a lot of the things that you just described? I mean, I know they're personal, right? But you've brought that ethos, you brought that spirit, that energy, that value system to this institute. Tell me what sort of your hopes are, not just for this podcast, but for all the projects that we involve ourselves in.
Yeah, so I think the sort of bigger picture to me, the kind of stuff that we've just talked about, I think could be framed as like humanizing STEM, but I want to take it a step further, which is like people are STEM. Like STEM and people are not two separate things. They are a ecosystem together.
Right.
Like people create STEM culture, and science, and that, it's all part of everything.
That in turn impacts people and their own
right. It's not just
social
about
structures and
content education requires relationships. Like it is relational in its core. So I think one of the exciting thing about RIOS is putting ourselves in places where we're, getting other folks to think about that earlier in their career, or we're showing everyone's viewpoint on this and creating a new storyline about what STEM is or could be. It's about changing the culture sort of strategically, but also using open as a tool for advocacy and for counter-narrating and for doing something about the current culture, whether that's opening up the black box, about having these conversations out in the open, whatever, all of the things, but also, we have other initiatives that are going on in a lot of places where, I'll just take some of the ones that I'm involved with because those are the ones I know the best. But one is sort of being involved on the next generation of the instructional practices guide for undergraduate mathematics curriculum. Okay, so like diversity and equity is like a thing at the end. So like, what if it's also throughout? What if it's, the humanizing is throughout? What if that's really part of it? Again, we're here this week at Bates for the Gordon Research Conference, which is all about, rethinking vision and change, revisioning vision and change, creating that new vision for biology education and what it means to think about that as human created, human driven, for humans, et cetera. And so I think, it's about showcasing the conversations. It's also about thinking strategically about where is this field going to go, nurturing it, pushing it, helping other leaders come in, spreading the word. I'm just excited about that level of work.
So I'm going to circle back to RIOS in a second because you brought up a new vision for change. And I want you to tell me in 2 to 3 sentences max.
Okay. I'll try.
What would you say is your personal new vision for change?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go back to what I just said before.
That's one
More
sentence.
concisely. STEM is people.
Uh-huh. Oh, Jesus. I said 2 to 3, man. I said, I'm with you. Just thanks for turning the tables on
I
me
was
there.
trying to be as concise as possible. I got there. Yeah, no, STEM is people.
Okay.
And for which people, right? I'll do a follow-up on that too, right?
Well, I think I read into your use of the word people that the inclusive is assumed or should be.
Yeah.
Right? That we shouldn't have to go about, defining it and, it's for you too, it's for you too. Like, that shouldn't be an extra message I have to send. If we're doing it right, then everybody understands that it's for everybody. And so I want to segue back a little bit to the O in Rios.
Mm-hmm.
And our good friend and colleague, Dr. Karen Kangliosi, is now here. She's director of Every Learner Everywhere. Wonderful human, and just done a ton of work on open science, open pedagogy, OER. And I've said, we've talked offline several times, and I've said one of the things that have really excited me about Rios is the potential around open to get at broader questions of democracy and access and not just democracy, but participatory democracy, right? That this notion that we are all part of knowledge generation, knowledge creation, knowledge curation. And maybe I just want to hear your thoughts on how open lands with you.
Yeah. I had this wonderful conversation with a colleague of mine, Dr. Anna, while she was here at Bates as a visiting assistant professor, and we were chatting. We have some common interests in sort of digital activism. And she was saying, as she teaches some of her courses, it's a lot of critique because she comes from gender and sexuality studies and from humanities, and that's a lot of sometimes critiquing a lot of things about current society. But then some students lose hope because there is, such crap in the world. Look, I had to work not to use a swear word. Such crap in the world.
It's a podcast. FCC doesn't care.
And so, I was like, I really feel like one thing I can add to this, new imagination building is besides my eternal optimism, this agency-based, building with students, building agency to make a difference, but then with what do you do? And I feel like open as resistance has been a really, really important tool, at least for me, throughout my life. So what does it mean to think about open as active resistance to the system?
Tell me more about that.
So I think this goes on so many levels, but let's talk about it from the economics perspective, right? And the power is concentrated in knowledge. Who has access to that knowledge? The kind of knowledge that's at one university versus the kind of knowledge that folks have access to in another. So that's controlled by universities, and it's controlled by textbook publishers, and it's controlled, and so there's power, money, resources all tied up. So when we think about just the strict open education, making your curriculum open, making conversations about how you teach and what you teach open, that's a form of resistance against those power systems that separate us into the have and have nots. But then you look at, I teach a lot now about the digital human interface. And, we know that, as we critique things like AI open in terms of social media and transparency requirements for AI and open sourceness, and access to tools, all of that is direct open as resistance to conversations about how technology is shaping things moving forward. And then let's take it another sort of other personal level. These conversations open, talking about what happened to somebody on your CV. I follow this other great podcast called Mathematically Uncensored, and I just love that they're open, talking about these conversations in the open. And, you know, it could be, you know, telling folks how this made you feel and just opening it up for other people to see. I think of that as just a different version of opening the black box on a mathematical model or a computational model. It's like opening it up, and here's what went into that whole process.
Yeah.
You know, opening up and talking about what you get as a salary and how you got that salary, like the things that are supposed to be taboo, right?
This is actually really interesting because it is because, oh my God, I feel like we could talk for hours here because you are getting into a philosophical space of open being beyond, you know, I think what I mentioned to prompt the question was open in a very political, social structure context. You seem to be describing open as a philosophy and a value system.
I'm always going bigger, Brian.
I know that. And then it's and so in that context it goes beyond just, you know, how it applies to good governance and social structures. It goes into how we live our lives and create relationships, right? And it pushes past things like proprietary and this need to kind of commodify and become an economic good and quantity and things like that. And so then that raises a whole bunch of other interesting follow-up questions, right? But I guess maybe just selfishly from the Rio's perspective, it excites me that there's all these other things to other rabbit holes to run down. The more we lean in as a group to the a name.
Yeah. You know, we just had, you know, great conversations earlier about, you know, moving from me to us.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think like, unfortunately there is an I in Rio, so I don't know. Maybe it should have been a you for us. I don't know.
You wanted to use the joke, there's no I in Rios, but there's an I in Rios.
Okay.
Because it spoiled your one joke, we need to go ahead and change our whole name. Is that what you're trying to say?
But I think I think that's like part of the culture of not just STEM but broadly, right? So rethinking, when we start thinking about open, we start thinking about really democratizing all kinds of knowledge, right? And all systems and processes, right? Then yeah, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about thinking about us as a community and helping each other instead of how do I help myself.
Yeah.
And that's a mindset shift, especially considering how our economy is built and run.
Right. So let me kind of circle back to a point you brought up earlier that stuck with me about post 2016 and Border Patrol. And this, again, selfishly, is one of the reasons why I feel a professional connection with you that I think is a little rare, because unprompted, you bring up things that I think about and I don't hear in other places, right? And one of those things is, I think about January 26th, 2022. I'm blanking on the year, but when I say Jan 6, you know exactly what I mean. And I've often compared that to in the 1920s when there were lynchings and who attended those lynchings, right? And who attended January 6th. And I think part of my job is to kind of think about broadly social function. How do we get this right? How do we continue this democratic experiment in a way that everybody's a part of it and can live long, peaceful, happy lives? Like, that's sort of a guiding question of my professional life. And I find that in situations like January 6th, there's a reactivity, right? There's a reaction of bad people, put them on trial, let's move on, kind of thing. And not enough of, well, what lessons can we learn from understanding what led to this, so that we hope to not repeat this kind of thing in the future if we are to work as a country, right? And one of the things that stick with me is we gave those people degrees, right? We gave them high GPAs in some cases and said, summa cum laude, you go and start a business, go and be a lawyer, go and be X, Y, and Z. And you know, we give a lot of other people degrees too, but there's a feeling of responsibility, I feel, where I worry that especially in STEM, we kind of assume almost that because you are a chem major, all the other values associated with being a good, noble, community-driven participant of a society just automatically kind of comes with that. And we don't have to be explicit about those values at the undergraduate level in particular. And I know I'm going on kind of a while here, but I just want to make the point that part of, to the extent that we are John Dewey acolytes here, and that education is built to help prepare people for democratic participation. What are we doing in STEM classrooms and STEM research, STEM education research, etc., to be intentional about that? And so you bringing up Seeking Border Patrol and knowing that you have students who are going to go into that, so the mentality they go into that with matters, right?
And I think there are two things going on. So one, in that particular case, we were educating them for environmental professions, thinking first of all,
right,
that had they didn't need this kind of ethics training because they were just going to be, I don't know, out tagging bear or something like that, right? And so there is, that also is a misconception because now, there's been, especially in sort of hashtag Black in STEM and other places, there's been a lot of folks talking about they can't go bird watching because somebody's going to say, why are you here on your own as a Black man? And so now we know that that's, well, some of us know that is false, right? And then there is this sort of idea of what do you think you're preparing students for versus what are you actually preparing students for?
Right.
And coming from teaching mathematics, I think this is something that we as a community in mathematics have been struggling with on and off, because teaching something, that counts as a math requirement so you can get your check mark on general education is algebra, teaching them to really think as critical citizens moving out in the world, right? So they think there's what do we think we're doing versus what we are. And I think one of the coolest talks that I heard, also someone responding to the 2016, was Carl Bergstrom talking about their calling bullshit curriculum. And that was how are we educating future voters,
right?
to realize whether the thing they got shared on Facebook is totally false or not. Right. They can vote for whatever as long as they don't believe BS information, right? I'm kind of taking the the partisan out, but still, at the end of the day, are we really preparing folks? And I don't think those skills are totally different than what we say we're doing in science with critical thinking and all these other things. I think they're very related. But also acknowledging, hey, this isn't just about the outside, what you're going to see on the ballot. This also affects your discipline. And that's a whole nother conversation. People are but this is ecology. This doesn't have anything to do with humans. I'm like, wait a minute.
Not a single thing.
Not a single thing. Yeah.
Nothing.
So I think I'm pretty excited about one of it's not going to solve all problems, but one of the things that Bates is doing structurally is now we are requiring that students take 2 courses that address power, privilege, place, race, racism in as graduation requirements. And one of them must be in your major discipline. And I think it's an acknowledgement that this is not a separate. So I worry a lot about transference.
Yeah.
You did your ethics requirement or you did your critical thinking requirement. But that doesn't have anything to do with science.
Right.
And
I like that last piece. Yeah. No, I'm 100%. Yeah.
I mean, we've been saying this in math forever. I finished my math requirement, but what does that have to do with, my major in political science or something, right? So I think just even making that a requirement, yes, of course, we hope it changes, what we're graduating students with. But at the core, it's making a statement that, yes, we believe that discussions on power and privilege and race deserve to be in every major.
Right.
And just because you think you're going to send someone off to tag bears doesn't mean they don't need a conversation.
Yeah. I'll just ask one quick last question on the Bates point. Can you comment if you know anything on on if there is something in place to assess, especially the major class one. And the reason why I ask is one of the things I worry about with all these really good initiatives is that it comes from the heart, it's well-meaning, I agree with it, right? But then 5-6 years down the road, nobody can really have somebody can come down the line and say, oh, you were just indoctrinating a bunch of students. Like, no, you shouldn't have to do that. And we don't have a response other than we thought it was a good idea, right? And I'm just wondering if there's something in place that if there are goals associated with having that class in the major, is there some assessment in place to figure out, if that was valuable and why?
So there is a committee that's charged with like overall looking at the requirement in those classes itself. And I think right now they're more concerned with what goes in because, before they address what goes out. Though I tell you, I'm around here looking at posters at the GRC, looking at, possible survey instruments and other kinds of things that I can bring back to my institution. Right. Because I think we want to know that we're making a difference. Right. I think there is some resistance from some folks. Oh man, we're going to assess the heck out of it. That's why I didn't go into K-12 education. Right. But yeah, as the eternal optimist, don't you want to know if you're making a difference?
Well, it's funny because GRC is at your institution, so you don't have to bring anything back. You just need to lock the doors. Like, it'll only take a minute.
With permission,
it'll only take.
I will share, the contact
this will be
information.
Painless. This was. You signed a waiver. Yeah. It is what it is. All right. Hey, Carrie, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Brian.
Knowledge Unbound is brought to you by the Rios Institute for a racially just, inclusive, open STEM education. We are generously funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. You can find out more about the podcast at our website. Click on the bio in our link. There you'll find more about Dr. Eaton's work at Bates College and a transcript of today's episode, as well as several of Dr. Eaton's interests and other projects related to the podcast. You'll also find a link to the Rios Institute where you can peruse some of our other projects, the working groups, learning communities, and other projects that we've been involved in. Our producer today is Mr. Segev Amasai, Computer Engineering major, Florida International University, class of 2025. I'd like to thank my guest, Dr. Carrie Diaz-Eaton, for spending some time with us, sharing her vision. I'm always moved and marveled when I get a chance to be in conversation with people like Carrie, because I guess part of it is commiseration, part of it is, people see beyond what this could be, right? People don't stay satisfied. They don't just accept that because the system tells you to do X, Y, Z, that there isn't more to do, and willing to maybe even put themselves at some professional risk to make it happen. So to the extent that that's a reminder for me and a reminder for you, my listener, to be likewise brave, I hope it was a good listen. As you go into the week, I hope you look forward to our next guest or next episode. And really, all equity-based, inclusive, social justice education is trying to imagine a world where all of us are part of each other's in-group. So, my name is Brian Dewsbury. Until the next episode, please be excellent to each other.
I think the sort of bigger picture to me, the kind of stuff that we've just talked about, I think could be framed as like humanizing STEM, but I want to take it a step further, which is like people are STEM. Like STEM and people are not two separate things. They are a ecosystem together. I think there are two things. I think one is a number of student interactions over the years, where they've, maybe also reflecting on my own, like what really made a difference in me choosing my career path. And yes, it was my relationships with certain individuals that, you know, just kept encouraging me. I had always been at a huge, flagship universities. So I didn't have that experience exactly.
Right.
So I had to figure out what that meant.
Yeah.
I think that was something I have gotten much better at over the years as a teacher. I look back at how I initially started. And yeah, I really do think that being at that small liberal arts college was something that really changed my mindset about what's the role of the relationship with the student.